All right, well, welcome to the August 2019 version of the Prepared for Environmental Change webinar series. Today's topic is the unexpected consequences of urban and rural flooding. My name is Andrea Webster. I am the implementation manager here at Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute. So we're really excited about today's panel. We'll get into that in a minute, but before we get started, I want to share a few slides with you to tell you a little bit about the Institute. So we have many resources that we offer in addition to this webinar series. We have the ERIT, which is our Environmental Resilience Institute Toolkit. This is an online resource center to help local governments in Indiana and in the Midwest generally to find funding opportunities and case studies and plenty more as they're preparing for climate change impacts. We also partner with an organization here on the IU campus. It's called Sustain IU, and they offer a sustainability extern program. So every summer, we send about 30 very talented Indiana University students to work with local governments, nonprofit organizations, and businesses on sustainability projects for a 10-week period every single summer. So if you're interested in hosting one of those externs, visit the website that's on the screen here. We do a call for hosts in the fall, so we'll certainly announce that via email and on our webinar series once that application is live. We also have the Hoosier Resilience Index, which is under development and will launch in November of 2019. This is a tool that will allow local government this tool is very specific to Indiana, just like the Indiana Sustainability Development Program, whereas the Hoosier Resilience Index will help local governments understand what their specific vulnerabilities are to climate change and how to prepare for those impacts. We have a few upcoming webinars. We're doing the next two webinars in September and October will focus on public health. And in November, once we launch the Hoosier Resilience Index, we'll do a webinar to review that tool with you. And then in December, we'll talk about the zoning codes and comprehensive plan strategies that can be adopted to help you better prepare for climate change from a long-term standpoint. So we hope that you'll enjoy today's webinar and you'll join us for future events. We have a couple of co-hosts. One is the Association of Indiana Counties, and the other one is Accelerate Indiana Municipalities. These are the professional development organizations for county and local governments in the state of Indiana. And I encourage you to check them out if you're interested and if you're not already engaged with them. We have a number of folks joining us today from Indiana and beyond, and we really appreciate your support, and we hope you find these helpful and that you share them with your colleagues. We do record all these webinars, and we are recording the webinar today. And so we have an archive of the recordings that you're able to access after the webinar. So everybody is muted today, and you're welcome to unmute yourself towards the end of the webinar when we do the questions and answers, but we ask that you do not unmute yourself until then. If you have questions during the presentations, we encourage you to enter those into the chat function, which can be found by hovering your mouse over the webinar screen, and you should see a box pop up that says chat function, that says chat. You can click on that and enter your questions. If it's a clarifying question, I will politely interrupt the speakers, or Joe Lang, who is joining us from Environmental Resilience Institute, may also help politely interrupt the speakers. He's joining us today to help with the webinar moderation and the question moderation. So with that, I am very pleased to introduce the speakers that we have today. We have, for our topic of unexpected consequences of urban and rural flooding, we're doing a focus on North Carolina. And so all of our speakers are North Carolinians. First, we have Blakely Hildebrand, who is a staff attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center. She joined SELC in 2014 and focuses her time on protecting water quality and coastal resources in North Carolina. She's a native of the state, and she attended the University of North Carolina for her undergraduate and law degrees. Before joining SELC, she worked in Capitol Hill for the City of New York and in a national higher education nonprofit organization. We also have Nick Torrey. Nick grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He earned his undergraduate degree at Stanford University and completed graduate work at the University of Chicago before attending Yale Law School. He's a staff attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center, where he represents a variety of conservation groups and coal ash litigation. We also have Jen Smits. She is the Principal Water Resources Planner for the Triangle J Council of Governments, where she provides technical assistance and organization support on comprehensive and collaborative watershed planning for local governments, state and federal agencies, and non-governmental organizations. So I think Jen will get into this a little bit more, but the Triangle J Council of Governments covers the Raleigh-Durham, the Triangle area. So if you're not familiar with North Carolina, it covers that area. So she spent 10 years working as an environmental consultant in Seattle, with focuses on stormwater, sediment, and aquatic ecology before moving to the Raleigh-Durham area. Since then, she's also worked with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, Division of Water Resources, and the City of Raleigh Stormwater Management Division. So we have this fabulous panel today, and they will discuss recent examples of coal ash and hog farm hazards stemming from flooding. So that will cover the rural unexpected consequences of flooding. And then Jen will focus on the hidden urban impacts that were illustrated by a recent resilience assessment in her area. So with that, I will pass it over to Blakely and Nick to get us started.
All right, can you all see our screen here?
Yes, we can.
Yes, very good. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. Again, my name is Blakely Hildebrand. I'm an attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center. Nick and I work at SELC together in our Chapel Hill office. For those of you who aren't familiar with SELC, we are a nonprofit legal organization with 9 offices throughout the Southeast. We have offices in DC as well. Our mission is to use the power of the law to protect clean water, clean air, special places, and communities throughout the Southeast. As I mentioned, Nick and I are both in our Chapel Hill office, and we're glad to be joining you today. I will jump right in because I know we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. I'll be focusing my comments on flooding from industrial animal operations in North Carolina. What I'd like to cover in the next few minutes includes a brief overview of the waste management systems at these facilities, the impacts that these facilities have on communities and the environment, what happens at these facilities when we experience major flooding events, as we have many times over the last several years, and some possible solutions for improving resiliency moving forward. And I'll try to cover all of that in about 7 minutes or so, so bear with me. Let's see, nice slide. There it is. All right. So this is an aerial view of an industrial swine operation. Most swine operations in North Carolina use a waste management system that we commonly refer to as the lagoon and spray field system. Which is used at this facility here that you can see. Hogs are housed in the barns to the right. And they produce about 2 to 5 times the amount of waste as we as humans do. The urine and feces from these hogs is then piped into that Pepto-Bismol pink lagoon that you see. These lagoons are open-air lagoons. They're often unlined. And what happens in the lagoon is that the solid waste falls to the bottom and the liquid waste to the top. And that liquid waste is then pumped to an irrigation system and spread on cropland nearby. Some amount of that waste is used as fertilizer, but oftentimes this liquid wastewater is over-applied, and so the waste that's applied is no longer being used in any kind of beneficial way. North Carolina is the #1 hog producing state in the country. We have approximately 10 million hogs in the state at any given time. That there are more hogs here than there are people. And this is a map of where many of those facilities are located. The pink dots that you see here are industrial swine operations. The yellow dots that you see here are industrial poultry operations, which is a growing industry in North Carolina. Sampson and Duplin counties, which are the 2 counties in the center of your screen, are the top 2 hog-producing counties in the country. And you'll notice that there's a concentration of these facilities in about a 10-county area, all of which are located in the coastal plain in North Carolina. The environmental and public health harms caused by the lagoon and Sprayfield system are very well documented. These are just 2 of the many articles that have been published on this issue. The lagoon and Sprayfield system releases pollution through seepage from the lagoons into the high groundwater table in eastern North Carolina. Liquid waste runs off of spray fields into rivers and streams that flow through these facilities, or flow around these facilities. And this wastewater has a very high concentration of bacteria, fecal matter, and nutrients for nitrogen and phosphorus, which when it runs off into surface waters, our rivers and streams, can lead to harmful algal blooms, fish kills, and contaminate drinking water for people across eastern North Carolina. And that's not to mention the noxious odors that really have an impact on the people living nearby these facilities. And these facilities also cause major air quality concerns. The negative impacts of this industry are disproportionately borne by people of color and low-income communities in eastern North Carolina. So much so that the EPA has expressed grave concern about the environmental injustices that are inherent in this waste management system. So the environment and communities around these facilities experience all of those impacts on sunny days. But given the location of these facilities in the coastal plain and the primitive system in place that's used to manage the enormous amount of waste produced on these facilities, makes these facilities especially vulnerable to flooding during major rain events. The image that you see here is an image that was on the front page of many newspapers during Hurricane Floyd in 1999. During that storm, approximately 120 million gallons of untreated hog waste flooded into rivers and streams across eastern North Carolina. About 26 hog lagoons ruptured and 45 others were damaged during that storm. And while that was a terrible incident, I can say that a couple of good things came from that, that hurricane season, the hurricane season of 1999, spurred some action, some positive action. The North Carolina General Assembly instituted a moratorium on new and expanded hog operations, which it later made permanent. Smithfield Foods, the largest industry player in North Carolina, entered into an agreement with the Attorney General of North Carolina, under which the industry committed to investing money into developing better technology for managing hog waste. I'll note that very few of their facilities here in North Carolina have in fact implemented those technologies. And the Department of Environmental Quality, the primary regulator here in the state, had a permitting system that was well underway to regulate the waste management systems on these facilities. But despite all of that activity in the late 1990s and early 2000s, very little has changed. Climate change, as we all know, is happening, which is leading to increasingly intense and frequent storms across North Carolina and in the southeast. Hurricanes Matthew, Florence, and Michael have dumped record rainfall across eastern North Carolina, leading to hundreds of millions of gallons of untreated hog waste spilling into our rivers and streams and harming communities downstream. The purple on this map illustrates the highest amount of rainfall during Hurricane Florence in 2018. This was a second of 2,000-year flood events that we had here in eastern North Carolina. And you'll notice that the purple on this map overlays with the map that you saw a few moments ago with the highest concentrations of animal operations, just indicating how vulnerable these facilities are to flooding. This image shows a lagoon, a breached lagoon. You can see the untreated hog waste is flowing out of the corner of that lagoon into Tomahawk Creek, which is in Bladen County, North Carolina, and that waste eventually flowed into the Cape Fear River. Here's another image of a lagoon that is close to inundation. And while lagoons are primarily our concern, the spray fields also create concern and are extremely vulnerable to flooding as well. Operators ahead of storms typically lower the lagoon levels to make space for the additional rainfall that they're anticipating, which oversaturates fields. And so when we have a major rain event, those spray fields are also flooded, and hog waste moves flows into the rivers and streams and down and flows into people's homes, flooded homes and other structures. This is just a smattering of the headlines that we see after just about every major rain event here in Eastern North Carolina. So what needs to be done here? I would say the two takeaways. I hope two things I hope you take away from this are these. One, we've got to move away from the lagoon and spray field system for waste management in Eastern North Carolina. There are other technologies that exist. They're available to the industry, but the industry has not moved in the direction of adopting these cleaner technologies. Second, we need to get the most vulnerable operations out of the floodplain. The vast majority of these facilities are located in the 500-year floodplain, and many are still remaining in the 100-year floodplain. So what can government do? What is your role in this process? Well, unfortunately for us in North Carolina, local government has a very limited role to play. The permitting scheme is regulated by the state. The North Carolina General Assembly has limited the role that local governments can play in siting and other decisions that govern these facilities. But I want to highlight three things that either have been successful or have the potential to be successful in moving us in the right direction. The first is a buyout program that's funded both by state and federal dollars with the intention of moving facilities out of the 100-year floodplain. To date, about 43 operations have been moved out of the floodplain, including about 100 lagoons. This program is funded through various channels, one of those being disaster recovery funding that flows to the state after a major disaster. The second program is a lagoon conversion program, which was created by the North Carolina General Assembly in 2007. This is a cost-share program that allows the industry to adopt cleaner technology for managing waste and to move away from the primitive lagoon and spray field system. Unfortunately, this program has been much less successful. Only about a dozen facilities have taken advantage of this program. But we would like to see industry move in the direction of transitioning their facilities away from the lagoon and spray field system. And finally, we want the state regulators to require lagoons to be built to withstand stronger storms. We all know that storms are getting increasingly frequent and intense and leading to larger amounts of rainfall. But currently, these lagoons only need to be built to withstand a 24-hour, 25-year storm. We made the recommendation during the most recent permitting cycle that DEQ require these lagoons to be built to a 1,000-year storm standard. That recommendation was not adopted. But I will leave it there. We could talk much more, but I'll pass it over to my colleague Nick to talk about coal ash.
Okay. Hi there, I'm Nick Torrey, and I'm going to talk about coal ash lagoons, which are massive unlined pits on the banks of rivers and lakes that store millions of tons of industrial waste containing arsenic, mercury, lead, and many other toxic pollutants. These facilities are located right alongside rivers and lakes. They're held back only by earthen dams, and as a result, they're exceptionally vulnerable to storm damage and flooding. Unfortunately, they are all too often also located in communities that are low income or predominantly minority communities, and as I mentioned, they're located on the banks of important public water resources, including drinking water reservoirs. And so we have seen in North Carolina all too often the folly of this way of storing coal ash and major flood damage occur over and over again. In virtually every major storm, over the decades, there's been one kind of incident or another. So a few examples from recent years that we've seen. In 2016, Hurricane Matthew caused very significant flooding at a number of Duke Energy facilities, including this one on the Neuse River in Goldsboro, North Carolina. The entire power plant actually flooded, as you can see in this image. And the coal ash storage at this site is actually two different locations, these large red areas, along the Neuse River, which runs through this map. And what happened here, I think, is illustrative of the problems. Where the yellow diamond is, Duke Energy had old coal ash storage areas on the banks of the river. Those completely flooded. The light blue shading in this image is actually where the floodwaters rose up to. So this area on the left was completely flooded, and where that yellow diamond is, you can see the coal ash coating the trees and flooding the waterway there. Over on the right of the image, Duke Energy had a major dam failure. These, again, what they have holding back their coal ash impoundments are unlined earthen dams. That's also the kind of dam that was separating a large cooling lake from the Neuse River. And as floodwaters rise up on the outside of the dam and then recede rapidly, they weaken the dam. And so in this case, it was, I suppose, lucky that the dam failure occurred at the cooling lake, not at the coal ash impoundment, but it could just as well have been. So here's an image of this 50-foot section of the dam that just let go in the aftermath of the flooding during this storm. And what's significant about this is Duke Energy was assuring the public that their dams were safe. That morning, they said the dams had been inspected. They had everything under control. And a few hours later, Duke Energy only learned of this major collapse when a TV news crew alerted them to it. 2 years later, in Hurricane Florence, we had exactly the same set of problems recur. So at the same site on the Neuse River, we again had whole areas of coal ash storage inundated and flooded, coal ash released into the Neuse River yet again. And then also we've had more major dam failures from these earthen dams, this time down south at Duke Energy's Sutton facility on the Cape Fear River. And there they had coal ash released into the Cape Fear and also into an important fishing lake for the community where many people fish to feed their families, called Sutton Lake. The coal ash lagoons are located on the banks of this lake, and they were overtopped in the storm, releasing coal ash into the lake. And then Duke Energy had, again, an earthen dam separating the lake from the Cape Fear River that let go and released that contaminated water also into the river. Once again, Duke Energy was telling the public repeatedly they had everything under control, the dams were safe, their coal ash storage was secure, and yet again we see it's just common sense. When it's stored in this obviously unsafe manner on the banks of rivers and lakes, problems are going to occur, and the utilities unfortunately can't be trusted to manage these situations. Another kind of problem that we've seen has to do with the regulatory filings they have to make with the state. They have to do these calculations to demonstrate that they can handle a design storm and a flood event. But we've seen that those submissions, which are prepared by paid environmental consultants who are working for the utilities, are not always reliable. So Duke Energy, again, this time in South Carolina, had this coal ash site on a lake in South Carolina. It actually also contained some nuclear waste in addition to coal ash, just to make things more exciting. And the report that they submitted to the regulatory agency, which purported to demonstrate they could handle a flood, was full of major basic and very serious errors in the calculations. And when we called those to the attention of the state regulator, they forced Duke Energy to redo those calculations. And when they did that, they concluded actually they needed to remove all the ash from this coal ash lagoon and move it into dry lined landfill storage further back from the lake. One last type of problem that we've encountered that is, I think, significant is that many of these coal ash lagoons are actually located in floodplains. So this is a site up near the Virginia line that Duke Energy operates on Hyco Lake, which is located in the 100-year floodplain. This red shading shows you the location of the floodplain. But rather than removing the ash from the floodplain or trying to deal with the problem, responsibly. Unfortunately, what we've seen is the utility actually tried to remove the floodplain from the ash. They went to FEMA and asked FEMA to revise the floodplain designation to try to get it away from where their coal ash lagoon is located. But fortunately, FEMA did not go along with this, and when they revised the map, they retained the floodplain designation for this area because nothing had actually changed, and it was still a major concern. And the state of North Carolina actually ended up citing this floodplain problem as one major reason why they ordered Duke Energy ultimately to clean up this site, although Duke Energy is still fighting that in court. Since you all, many of you represent local governments, I want to just take a moment and emphasize how important your voices are in dealing with this problem of irresponsible coal ash storage. We've seen in North Carolina and in South Carolina that it can make a huge difference when local communities speak up and call on the utilities, call on regulators to remove the ash from unlined lagoons on the banks of rivers and lakes, get it into dry line storage or recycling. So this is an example of a resolution passed by the County Commission in North Carolina for one local coal ash site in their community. We've seen it in South Carolina as well, and that has really been beneficial in getting coal ash cleaned up and actually avoiding some of these problems going forward. So in conclusion, many of the statements and filings that these utilities make, unfortunately, have not proven to be reliable. Communities need to hold the utilities accountable. You all have Duke Energy in Indiana as well, but all the coal ash storage that's in these unlined lagoons is inherently unsafe and needs to be cleaned up. So use your voice and don't let this happen to you. Thanks.
All right. Can you guys hear me? Thank you, Blakely and Nick. That was actually a really great segue into what I'll be talking about again from the Council of Governments perspective, and I will spend a minute talking about what a Council of Governments is. But if you noted at the beginning of the presentation, I loved how they had included that unexpected consequences are sort of crossed out, right? So with some proper planning and analysis, a lot of these impacts can be foreseen, and a lot of what we're working on now in the Triangle area is working with the champions and elected officials and other sort of leaders in the region to be more proactive about this type of planning, as well as some of the more subliminal impacts that you might not think about that impact us on a local scale. As they mentioned, there were several large storm events in the last couple of years, several 500-year storm events. So a bit of an unprecedented way for us to start looking at these impacts and hopefully move forward to being more resilient. So as I promised, I'll spend a couple of seconds talking about what a Council of Governments is for good reason. A Council of Governments might also be called a planning commission or regional council, but we basically operate exactly like a public entity, a government entity. We are considered a local government, but of course no one lives within our tax base or our ETJ like a city or a town. So we don't have a tax base or constituency, but we are a local government. And so that lets us be a really neutral entity to help convene and collaborate across jurisdictional boundaries. The Triangle J region, the J means nothing. It was just A, B, C, D, E, F, G, so don't worry about the J. We're the only one that has retained it since then, but these are the cogs sort of overlaying with the state of North Carolina. And since many of you are outside of the region, this will help orient sort of where we are. Blakely and Nick talked about a lot of the coastal impacts in Cape Fear River Basin. I as well work in the Cape Fear River Basin. That's sort of overlaying here. But the Triangle is, of course, the Raleigh-Durham and Chapel Hill metropolitan area, which is growing incredibly quickly. We're projected to be basically one big metropolitan blob in the next several decades, about the size of the DC area. So we're growing really, really quickly, and we're falling farther and farther behind with these climate change impacts and the more frequent and intense storm events. So I like to include this screenshot because, as Blakely and Nick mentioned, Hurricane Florence and Matthew and Michael and even back to Floyd, there's generally a pattern, right? The coastal communities are really heavily impacted. But this was a screenshot from where the projected Florence path was at one point. It was projected to just basically decimate the capital. Of course, it turned at the last minute. If any of you are familiar with kind of that storm last year, it did turn, but that was unexpected. So I like to include this as a reminder that regardless of where we are, we don't have to be a coastal community to deal with some of these same impacts. So we need to be thinking about how we're changing. And we found that there's really four basic overall changes that are affiliated with climate change and then exacerbated by our growing region. So increasing extreme precipitation events, of course, local flooding and disaster flooding, increasing temperatures and temperature variability. It is hot down here. It does not get cool at night anymore. And that has really impacted both our socially vulnerable communities as well as just infrastructure in general. Increasing frequency and duration of drought conditions. So we're kind of living in this feast and famine world now where we might have these huge storm events, but we might very well have another drought. We had a drought of record less than a decade ago, and so we're kind of primed for another with this climate change. And all of these impacts are really exacerbated by the fact that we're growing so quickly, both in our Triangle region and across the state. The state as a whole is growing quickly, even with agricultural investment and everything in the state as well. So as I mentioned, we're kind of a deluge and drought state. This is a picture from Hurricane Michael, which I think was downgraded to a tropical storm by the time it made it to our region, but it was still, several counties in our region were declared because of that storm as well. So obviously we have some road infrastructure issues, but this is our Falls Lake watershed, which is the major water supply for the capital and beyond. This was back in the 2007 to 2009 range, where we had a significant drought. And again, we're probably primed for another coming soon. So, we've talked a lot about these major storms, Florence and Michael and Matthew. But one of the things that's sort of that subliminal underlying impact that we might not think about is how our city and town leaders manage their risk. So as urban growth increases, we have these increasing frequency and duration and intensity of disasters, but we also end up basically each time with a bigger and bigger shortfall. So as of last November, the Hurricane Florence impact was expected to be about $17 billion to the state, and almost $9 billion of that is not currently covered by either federal or state recovery programs or private insurance. So that's a significant gap, and that doesn't go away. And we're probably going to have another storm in the next year or two and the same impacts. So what I've circled here is one of those unexpected impacts we might not think about. And of course, working with the local governments, this is high on their mind. This Moody's bond rating, they're less willing to give communities a good bond rating if they haven't shown resiliency to disasters, as well as having some sort of risk assessment in place. So that's something that those champions that Nick was talking about, those elected officials and the loud noise folks, right? The squeaky wheels and the champions that we need. Those are things they care about, and those are important points to keep in mind. So the monetary impact of Florence, this is just a couple of statistics, probably very loose at the time. We're continuously revising what we knew of the impact from those storms, but they're broken out here in a couple of different ways for a reason. We'll get into that in a second. But commercial properties, residential properties, agriculture, and others, and it's significant. And this is again just one storm, and we've had 2 or 3 in the past couple of years that are of this magnitude. So I wanted to talk really quickly about sort of what our government is trying to do. Executive Order 80 was from our Governor Roy Cooper. He was recently elected, and of course legislature changes with that bring new opportunities. And Executive Order 80 was released earlier this year that kind of directs all of the various cabinet agencies, state level agencies, to think about climate change and risk assessment. So there's all sorts of various directives that are listed here, but the one that I've circled is to create a statewide risk assessment and resiliency plan. So we're more proactive about the kinds of impacts that SELC has outlined, as well as many, many others that we deal with every day still in the recovery mode. Many of the counties that are in the Triangle J region are still recovering and still will likely be recovering when the next storm happens. So the state is trying to be proactive with this EO 80 and think about how they can produce resources that help communities help themselves become more resilient. And as part of that, we'll talk about the Triangle Regional Resiliency Partnership and the assessment that the Triangle region produced and how this might be replicated at the state level. So these are a couple of the things, again, that the government and the other state agencies and even federal agencies are identifying as needs for both North Carolina and other states across the country dealing with similar impacts. So as I mentioned, EO80 is having this cabinet agencies, DEQ, DOT, all of the agencies work on a resiliency plan that helps assess risk and vulnerabilities to natural and built infrastructure, as well as developing community level resiliency plans. That's the key there. That's again where those leaders and sort of champions in each region can be important. And if you do have a COG in your region, I highly encourage you to reach out to them for assistance. We are again here to help. We operate as a convening and mediator sort of agency. From the US EDA, I like to include this. So the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategies, which are plans in place for any economic development district across the country, is now being required to include resiliency in their updates. So economic development funding will now have to have a sort of resiliency tie-in, and that's an important consideration, an important stipulation for these types of funding opportunities. And again, at the bottom, just from everyone, all the elected officials that we work with, business owners, private citizens, public entities, we need this kind of plan, this kind of assessment to really know where we're going and how to deal with the impacts of these disasters moving forward. So I wanted to just briefly talk about what kinds of risk analyses are happening in the Triangle, and again, hopefully replicating across the state as EO80 moves forward. This U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit is widely available, freely available through climate.gov, so that's nothing proprietary to me, but it's a good step-by-step process that we used here. And one of the key things, again, these hidden impacts, these unexpected impacts that we were asked to talk about today, are things that you're just not going to capture with the general run-of-the-mill hazard mitigation plan type planning that most communities are doing. So hazard mitigation plans, for those on the call who aren't familiar, are sort of a mandated plan put in place that often sits on the shelf, if we're honest, but really allows communities to check that box and say, we've done this, and therefore we are able to declare disaster funding, or we're able to claim disaster funding. It's honestly just a check on the box there. A lot of communities don't really put it into place, and it generally doesn't go to the level of detail that would be needed to counteract or be proactive about some of these impacts. So I like to talk about the hidden impacts that such a resiliency type assessment, really getting into the nitty gritty, would reveal that would otherwise be hidden with a hazard mitigation plan. So this picture basically tells the entire story. If you were to look at both of these homes on a hazard mitigation plan, or basically just a floodplain map, it would be a binary conclusion. They're either both in or both out of the floodplain. But as you can see, one of these is more resilient to flooding. And those kinds of sort of locally detailed planning items are not going to come out in your normal in or out of the floodplain type planning. So going a little bit further and thinking about the vulnerability of each of these structures and all of the other structures in your community, utilities, hospitals, road infrastructure, especially socially vulnerable populations, how vulnerable they truly are to flooding. And then, of course, the risk to that, for instance, the consequence. If this were a single family home versus a kindergarten, the consequence of the latter would be more significant in the event of a disaster. So going this extra step can really reveal some of these hidden impacts that we might not otherwise see with our general run-of-the-mill planning. And I'll fly through a couple of these pictures, just sort of the maps from the resiliency assessment that I believe Andrew will be sending out to registrants. This is sort of talking about all of the exposed properties, exposed just being sort of residential properties that are exposed to flooding based on FEMA flood maps. There's over 14,000 properties just in our Triangle region. But really, if you were to drill down the way I just mentioned, only 3,000 of them are at medium or high vulnerability and risk. And so this really allows local leaders and government entities to sort of streamline their resources and more effectively focus on areas that need it, rather than blanketing the area with aid when a disaster strikes. And one of the things I like to point out here is the hashed lines there. That those are areas with high social vulnerability from the CDC. So it's important to know those are communities of color or other minority communities. So again, I'll just fly through these really quickly. These are various maps that show sort of the same thing: road access and flooding, how many properties are sort of at that high or medium risk. Dams, as Nick was mentioning about coal ash dams, there's many privately owned dams across the region. And the level of maintenance and security on those is generally unknown. So this is a map of what we knew to be dam security with a flooding risk involved there. And this map, while it shows nothing, it can be useful to have, an absence of information is helpful too. So community leaders are able to easily pinpoint where they could access resources and utilize the resources most effectively for dealing with these issues. So in conclusion, some of the examples that have come out of these types of resiliency planning efforts are really just to implement things like stormwater utility fees. Those are on the rise here in our region because of these impacts that we've talked about here on this call today. Communities are trying to be a little bit more proactive about having resources on hand rather than only asking for recovery resources in the event of a disaster. Stormwater utility fees are a great way to do that. Updating floodplain maps to know where there's nuisance flooding areas, not just what FEMA might say is a flooding area. And working with their elected officials on incident response is huge. Just a couple of examples. There's a lot more out there. I want to thank you for your time, and I think we're ready for questions.
All right, well, thank you, Jen, Blakely, and Nick for these presentations. I think it's really insightful to see that even in a state that's been experiencing these heavy impacts for over a decade now, close to two, is still working on these things and developing solutions. And it sounds like you have a few that we could replicate here in Indiana. And then, of course, in Indiana, we don't get hurricanes, but we certainly get those heavy extreme precipitation events. And so I think that there's a lot we can learn from you. So thank you so much for spending some time with us today. So we have a couple of questions that have come in already. One was about the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, and it looks like Eric, our guest Eric, has found that website and posted it there for everybody. And I'll make sure to send that out in the follow-up email too, so you have a direct link to it in your inboxes. We also have a question that came in from Wanda, and she asks, what is the current state of the North Carolina rivers where they had much of the coal ash and hog feces dumped into it last year? How long did it take for the contamination to clear?
Sure. I mean, it's hard to measure these things because they occur, in under very unsafe conditions. So, I'd say basically the extent of those impacts was probably unknown. As Blakely mentioned, I mean, with both of these kinds of storage of pretty serious waste, there's an ongoing leakage of pollutants from these unlined lagoons into the waterways that's happening continuously and flows into the waterways as well. So it's a continued source of pollution, and it's also a continued risk of another incident or another disaster. But it's hard to measure what the what the after effects might be from a particular storm.
And Blakely, I think that you mentioned that one of the solutions that North Carolina is trying to implement is a cost share program to allow industry to adapt technology that's better suited to protecting from these breaches. Can you talk a little bit about what that technology is?
Sure. So there are a lot of different types of technology that could move the industry away from the lagoon and spray field system. And I'll say every facility is different. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Under the Smithfield Agreement, which I alluded to in the presentation, Smithfield Foods and the Attorney General entered into an agreement in the year 2000 that committed to developing cleaner technology for managing hog waste that would address groundwater contamination, surface water contamination, air quality, emission, odors, and the long list of impacts that we've already discussed. And the researchers at North Carolina State University and elsewhere who developed these or researched these technologies came up with a list of technologies that could be viable alternatives to the lagoon and spray field system. Now, of course, nothing is cheaper than digging a hole in the ground and putting a lot of hog waste in it. And so there was some pushback from industry about the economic feasibility of many of those options. Now, that analysis was done in 2006. 13 years later, the cost of those technologies has come down dramatically. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I do know that those numbers have come down quite a bit. So there are options for some of these facilities. Just to name a few, super soils and Terra Blue. There are a couple of other technologies that would be useful, and I think I would be remiss not to mention that biogas technology in North Carolina is getting a lot of press attention right now. What that involves is capping a lagoon with an anaerobic digester, capturing the methane, processing that methane, and using it for energy, either on-site or off-site, injecting it into the pipeline and using it off-site. That current technology anaerobic digesters do not address the laundry list of environmental and public health concerns associated with the lagoon and spray field system, and in fact entrenches the use of the lagoon and spray field system. So I think it's important to remember that while biogas development is a hot topic here in North Carolina, it's not addressing the water quality, air quality, and public health concerns that are associated with this industry.
Okay, and William asks, do we see these industries starting to take steps to combat the changes due to climate change on flooding, and are they starting to use some of these adaptation methods?
I will confess, I don't think much has changed in the hog industry in North Carolina. Not much has changed in the last 20 years since we had major storms in the 1990s. It spurred some really positive action at the state level. Certainly communities and environmental organizations and conservationists have been asking for and demanding the state and the legislature require more accountability out of the industry. And we're seeing some positive changes on the margins, but there hasn't really been much change, certainly not initiated from the industry, to move in the direction of resiliency and building resiliency for these facilities.
On coal ash, predominantly what we've seen is that the utilities have responded only to litigation and to public pressure. And so that's what's driven a lot of the cleanups that are happening in our region. And there are a lot of cleanups happening in our region. We've got now about 250 million tons of coal ash contracted to be cleaned up in the southeast, which is over 70% of the lagoons. And that's a major step forward. There are some utilities that have voluntarily realized they needed to do this because it's just too much of a risk where they have sites in the coastal plain or particularly vulnerable areas. Georgia Power has, for example, decided to clean up some of those coal ash lagoons because they're just not feasible for long-term storage of coal ash. But by and large, utilities have unfortunately had to be held accountable by local communities, in the public sphere and in court.
And has North Carolina at the state level strengthened floodplain protection policies or laws? Like, for example, do they say that these facilities cannot be built in floodplains anymore?
So, Jen may have more to add to this, but with respect to hog facilities in particular, there is a moratorium on new and expanded hog operations in North Carolina. That moratorium has been in place since 2007. So certainly there's a recognition that we don't need more of these facilities, and certainly not more facilities that rely on this primitive waste management system. So to the extent that they have taken any action on the hog industry specifically, that's really the only action that's been taken. The legislature has funded the buyout program, which has helped to close out these facilities in the 100-year floodplain and transition that land into a conservation easement. I think that's really the extent of what state government has done on this issue.
And I will add to that. To my knowledge, there's no statewide policy on whether or not communities can allow building in the floodplain. And a lot of the local governments that we work with, it's up to them, and it varies widely. Some allow building in the 100-year floodplain. Some don't allow building even in the 500-year floodplain, our most proactive communities. So there are many that are grappling with buyouts of homes that are historically flooding, even in 1-inch rain events, monthly. There's a lot of precedent right now to try to figure out how to do that. But again, each community is sort of handling it individually. They might have different laws on the books or ordinances for their own community about what they allow building in the floodplain or buying out in the floodplain.
So that sounds like a policy that a local government can use to try to protect its residents from the impacts of flooding.
And again, one of the greatest reasons to have those champions, those elected officials and leaders, those decision makers, and educating them on these types of policies.
So we have a number of questions coming in, and I'll repeat like I did at the beginning that if you have a question, you're welcome to enter it into the chat function, which you can use by hovering your mouse over the video, and you'll see a little icon that says chat, and you can click on that and you can submit a question. And if you'd like to, you're also welcome to unmute yourself momentarily to ask a question. So Jen, I had a question for you. So you talked a lot about Executive Order 80 for local governments to get them to start thinking about being prepared. So it sounds like that requires a community to do resilience planning. And so I'm curious if that executive order requires the local governments to think about financial planning within that resilience plan.
So it has not required anybody to do anything yet other than the state level cabinet agencies. What we're hoping, I've been working with the EO80 team, is to replicate so the Triangle Regional Resilience Assessment was done voluntarily by communities in the Triangle. It has now become sort of the leader in how to do these types of plans. And so we're working with the EO80 team to hopefully replicate that across the state. But the intent of EO80 is to produce some sort of guidance or resources that does help communities help themselves. It's not in place yet, but that is the mandate, is that these cabinet agencies will look internally. So again, DOT and all of these other agencies, DPS, that help them look internally at resiliency. But in addition, DEQ is the lead on creating a climate risk assessment and risk analysis plan that will include a way for communities to build from the ground up. And yes, it would include financial resiliency in the grand scheme of things. It's a great question.
So if a local government were to come to you and say, how should I begin to plan for these massive financial burdens that we're going to encounter as a result of flooding or even the increasing temperatures? Do you have a good response for that yet? I know it's a hard question.
Well, of course, being from the water side, I'm always pushing stormwater utility fees. It's such an untapped resource, and so many communities are starting to realize that. Unfortunately, there are communities who might have a fairly progressive constituency or tax base there, but the elected officials may see it just as another tax, right? So it's a lot of communication and education in that regard. But just as an example, we have even small communities who wouldn't even need to implement a stormwater utility fee based on, they might not even be big enough to have a municipal stormwater permit. But by doing so, they're tapping into hundreds of thousands of dollars each year of revenue that they hadn't accessed before. That is then earmarked for things like stream restoration and flooding recovery and things like that. Which is very, very difficult to allocate money to when you don't have a specific fee for that. You would never be able to get the utilities to give up that type of money to work on stormwater restoration and prevention. So that's my first and foremost recommendation, but there's so many different opportunities to start working across jurisdictional boundaries and realize that your neighbors are dealing with the same thing.
Well, North Carolina and the Triangle region is certainly lucky to have a COG such as yourself to help facilitate some of that regional coordination, especially watersheds don't fit the jurisdictional boundaries that local governments have. So it's nice to have somebody coordinating the multi-community efforts.
Communities in your region have something similar to tap into.
We do. We have a few around the state. And if anybody has questions about that, you're welcome to email me. I can help you find the one in your local area. But they've certainly been really useful to some local governments here in Indiana. So, so speaking of financial planning, I know you mentioned some of bond ratings that are at stake as a result of this. And I know there's been some news recently about bond rating agencies actually purchasing climate scientist firms who specialize in making predictions about climate change impacts. And so, do you want to talk a little bit about or say anything more about that?
Well, the SELC folks might have a little bit more too to add to that. But in general, it's just one of the few things we've been able to find that motivates even the most reluctant elected officials, right? Even those who are the most sort of, been there a long time, sort of maybe a good old boys club and think, oh, everything's going along just swimmingly. That's one of the few things that's going to get them, money talks, and no community wants their bond rating to dip. It impacts every aspect of their local government and their town management. So I can't speak too much more to that. We haven't had, all that much experience other than this sort of risk over their heads, but I'm willing to use that if it helps people move in the right direction.
Yeah, there certainly is risks over their heads if they realize it or not. So it's certainly a good tactic to use. So we have about 4 minutes left. So I think I'd like to use this time. Of course, if our guests have any more questions, certainly send those to the chat bar. But if there are no further questions, I think I'll ask each of our panelists to just say, offer one piece of advice where a local government can insert themselves to try to better prepare themselves for these financial impacts and these environmental impacts and health impacts, in many cases that are happening as a result of climate change. So maybe we'll start with the SELC, the Southern Environmental Law Center.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. I think local governments can be really effective advocates for their communities, and would encourage local governments to really listen to their constituency, understand what's going on in their constituency, and be strong advocates for their communities to state government. I know, as I mentioned earlier, North Carolina is somewhat unique in that local governments have limited ability to work on some of the issues we've discussed today, but I think they can be excellent advocates for their constituents to state government, which really holds a lot of the power here.
No, that's absolutely right. And like I said, with coal ash, we've seen that make a big difference. On coal ash in particular, right now in the next year is when utilities are making decisions about how they're going to close their coal ash lagoons, and whether they're going to remove ash to safe storage or whether they're going to leave it in place forever. So this is the time to really speak up and demand accountability from utilities.
I think they covered a lot of the great points, sort of, be willing to speak to your constituents and know what your champion initiatives should be, but also be willing to think outside the box. Local governments are notorious for sort of doing things the way they've always been done. And so this is a great opportunity to realize that these types of events are, they're new and they're not going to stop. These kinds of disasters are going to continue happening, and our proactivity is going to be the best way to it. And I use an example of, being willing to work with your neighbors to consider merging utilities. Even something as simple as that, wastewater and water utilities are very difficult to keep solvent, and a lot of our smaller, more rural communities are struggling with insolvency and financial inabilities to cover some of these maintenance and infrastructure needs. And so a good opportunity would be to work with your neighbors and consider merging or regionalization. But that's something that's often a little bit scary to local governments, to give up your tax base, right, if it means your financial solvency is stronger for the community. So just one example of kind of thinking outside the box for local governments.
All right, all good advice. So it was really great to hear from all three of you today. And as I was saying earlier, I think this really helps illuminate that there's no shining solution to these really complex issues. And so it's going to take a lot of us to try to figure it out. And we're going to have to try things that are trial and error. And it's going to be hard and we might fail, but we'll learn from it. And eventually we'll find some solutions that work. So keep up the good work to all three of you and to our guests as well. And we hope you have a good afternoon, and please stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay. Take care, everyone.